What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Big 12 schedules officially came out late yesterday morning. We are going to start with the BYU Cougars for all the Big 12 teams. So BYU is up next in these schedule previews and very early projected record series. Before we look ahead to 2025, though, let's take a look back at what BYU did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for BYU. My projection for this team and my prediction for them was also a little bit low. My projection for them was 5-7, but my prediction for them was 3-9. So you could tell I was not really high on the Cougars last year. A lot of people were kind of expecting BYU to probably be close to being the worst teams in the Big 12 last year. Maybe also Arizona State, but BYU was actually a big surprise. They went 10-2 last year in the regular season, and this team was not really that far away from making it to the Big 12 championship and then also to the college football playoff. They had a great season last year, going 11-2 after kind of a disappointing season in 2023. Here was the schedule for them last year in 2024. And you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Southern Illinois on the road at SMU and then also on the road at Wyoming. So not a tough non-conference schedule. They beat SMU, of course, the team that was out of the ACC. They ended up going to the college football playoff. Yeah, that was a big win there for the Cougars, but SMU actually ended up going the playoff for the rest of the way. Then you look at their Big 12 schedule. You look at who they played at home last year in this conference. They played Kansas State, Arizona, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and also Houston. So they played, it looks like, 5 home games last year in the Big 12. And then you look at their road schedule. They played on the road at Baylor, UCF, Utah, and Arizona State. So a couple of losses here in the Big 12 from last year, coming against Kansas and Arizona State on the road. Obviously, the Jayhawks were kind of a disappointing team last year. That was kind of an embarrassing loss there for BYU. And then Arizona State. This was a game that probably decided who was going to make it to the Big 12 championship, and Arizona State won that game. So that was the schedule from last year. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is that schedule for BYU for the upcoming season. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who BYU plays in the non-conference this season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play Portland State, an FCS team, and then they play Stanford out of the Power 4 in the ACC. That'll be at home for BYU, and then they play on the road at East Carolina. So then a couple of cupcake games here, and then you got Stanford out of the ACC here in a non-conference game. That's a game that probably BYU will be favored in, if I'm not mistaken. Stanford wasn't really good last year, and Stanford as a program really hasn't just been on the rise. They're not the same program as they used to be. They have been absolutely terrible these last few years. They have not been really good in this 2020 era of college football. So that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now move on to the Big 12 schedule. We'll start with the home schedule in this conference for BYU. They'll play 4 home games this year in the conference. They'll play West Virginia, Utah, TCU, and UCF. So pretty winnable games. Every single game in the Big 12 is very winnable for all these Big 12 teams. This conference, again, is so competitive, and it's very hard to predict what's going to happen in the Big 12 like it was from last year. But yeah, they get all these games at home. West Virginia, Utah, TCU, and UCF. Utah and UCF were not really good last year. TCU and West Virginia, 2 pretty good teams. So those might be pretty competitive games. But let's now move on to the away schedule. They'll play 5 road games in the Big 12 this year. They're going to be playing on the road at Colorado, at Arizona, at Iowa State, at Texas Tech, and then on the road at Cincinnati. So all 5 of these games will be on the road. Arizona and Cincinnati were not really good last year. Arizona was actually really close to being the worst team in the Big 12 last year, but they had a first-year head coach, so that does make sense why they were not really good. Cincinnati really hasn't been on the rise with Scott Satterfield over the last 2 years. Colorado and Iowa State and Texas Tech, these are all pretty tough road games in my opinion for BYU. But like I said, any game is winnable here in the Big 12, especially playing on the road in this conference. Even though these are tough places to play, every game is pretty winnable. So that's your away schedule. Let's now move on back to the schedule here and go full game by game now. They will kick things off with Portland State on August 30th, and then they'll play Stanford after that on September the 6th. So they actually get an early bye week here, and it really comes at a really bad time, to be honest, if you're a BYU fan. You come out of the bye week to play East Carolina on the road. Yeah, that's not a really good spot for a bye week, and they'll play Colorado to open up Big 12 play. So you got back-to-back road games, one in the non-conference and then one in the Big 12. Colorado is a team that they beat last year in the bowl game, so that's going to be a revenge game there for the Buffaloes, and that game will be on the road on September the 27th. Then they'll play West Virginia on a Friday night, October the 3rd. That'll be a home game there for the Cougars, and then after that it's Arizona on the road on October the 11th. Then they'll come back to play rival Utah on October 18th, then on the road at Iowa State on October 25th. And then their second bye week actually is a little bit better than the first one. They go on the road to play Texas Tech here on November 8th. So they got back-to-back road games there with Iowa State and Texas Tech in the Big 12. But the good news is they get a bye week in between those back-to-back road games. And then they play TCU after that at home on November 15th. Then on the road at Cincinnati on November 22nd. And then they close things out with UCF on November 29th. So that's your schedule for BYU for 2025. Let's now get to the projection here for 2025 for the Cougars. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. If it's a 1% game in the red, of course, that's counted as an automatic loss. You're probably not going to see a lot of games here basically in the red or orange a lot because every team in the Big 12 is going to have at least a chance to win a game if they're going to be a clear underdog. But yeah, 20% games in the orange will be games where BYU will be favored by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. 40% games in the yellow will be games where BYU will be a clear underdog game by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that range. 50-50 games will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. 60% games in the purple. Those are games where BYU will be favored by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, and then your 80% games in the blue. Those are games where BYU will be favored by at least a couple of touchdowns by 10 to 14 points. And then your green games, those are your automatic wins here in this projection. So we'll start with that percentage here first. The games where BYU should be able to win here pretty easily. I got a couple of them on here. Portland State and East Carolina on the road. I think BYU will be big favorites in both of these games. You can make an argument that East Carolina should definitely be in the blue and everything, but that's a game that BYU should be able to take care of business, even though it's on the road. Let's say it's probably closer to that 90% mark instead of over 95%. Portland State's definitely over 95% because that's an FCS team, and again, East Carolina could be at that 90% mark, but I think both of these games, BYU should be able to clearly, win and everything. It would be a big shock if they were to lose one of these two games, but I just don't see that happening. So I think BYU gets automatic wins here with Portland State and East Carolina on the road. Not guaranteed wins, but we count them as wins here in this projection. Let's now move on to the blue games where BYU is going to be favored by about a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. I got three of them on here, Stanford, Utah, and UCF. So Stanford out of the ACC, I get it. That's a game that should be in the purple, but Stanford has not been really good in the last few years. Let's face it, BYU clearly is the better team and the better program. I think both of these teams are on each other's level, but BYU, just based off of where they were last year, they're definitely clearly the better team than Stanford is. And then I got a couple of Big 12 teams here in the blue. Utah and UCF, two teams that were not really good last year. I get it, they both should be in the purple as well, but just based off of last year, I got BYU a tier above these two teams in the Big 12 tier and everything. And again, it's kind of hard to say which teams will be favored in Big 12 games because almost every one of these games are all, 50-50 games, to be honest. That is why it is so tough to project and also to predict this conference in the Big 12. But again, as of right now, I'm going to put both Utah and UCF in the blue, where I think BYU is going to be favored by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then I got a couple of games here in the purple where I think BYU is going to be favored here by 6 or 7, 8 points, so by about a touchdown. I got a couple of them, Arizona and Cincinnati. Both of these games are on the road. That's the reason why they both end up in the purple instead of like the blue, to be honest, and instead of being a 50-50 game as well. But yeah, both of these games, Arizona and Cincinnati were not really good teams last year. BYU was much better than them last year compared. So yeah, BYU should be able to be favorites in these games by 6, 7, 8 points. But again, because they're on the road, that's the reason why they both ended up in the purple instead of like the blue. If these two games were at home for them, they would definitely be in the purple, or actually in the blue, I should say. And then if Utah and UCF are both on the road, those games would be in the purple as well. So those two games, I think BYU will be favored in both of them by 6, 7, 8 points. And then I got 5 50-50 games on here for BYU that really could go either way. Colorado, West Virginia, Iowa State, Texas Tech, and TCU. These are all games that really can go either way. Colorado, of course, you beat them last year in the Alamo Bowl. I get it. They blew them out. They should be probably favored, but Colorado, they'll probably take a big step back from where they were last year, but that should be a competitive game. Same thing for West Virginia and TCU. Both of those games are at home, but they should be competitive games. And then Iowa State and Texas Tech, same thing, but they're on the road. That's the reason why they're both 50-50 games. So that is what the 50-50 games is for BYU this year. Again, 5 50-50 games that really can go either way. And so let's now get a projected record here based on how tough this schedule is for BYU. Again, we count the green games as wins, the blue games as wins, and then you average out these 60% games in the purple at 60%. Then you average out these 50-50 games at 50%. That does give you a projected record based on how tough this schedule is. It comes out to be 9-3, so it definitely a better projection compared to last year for BYU. I definitely could probably see them going 10-2 or maybe like 8-4, to be honest, because again, the Big 12 is so hard to project and also to predict and everything. All these teams in this conference are just so pretty even, like how it was last year. The Big 12 race was definitely pretty even between all these teams, and any team can pretty much make it to the conference championship. But yeah, BYU's projection is based off of this schedule is 9-3 for 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments below. And also, give me your thoughts about BYU's schedule. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.